Lucille Spence Byard is one of the most pivotal figures in the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Her rejection for medical treatment due to her race at one of Adventism's flagship sanitariums on the Maryland-Washington, D.C. border in 1943 was the major catalyst for the formation of regional conferences, or Black-administered governance units, within the North American administrative structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In the preceding decades after the event, regional conferences transformed the Adventist Church, both in the United States, its country of origin, and around the globe. Indeed, Byard's rejection may be credited as marking an end and beginning for the still fledgling denomination, the end of a white, Western-dominated hegemonic leadership and membership, and the beginning of what may be termed the browning of Adventism. Today, approximately 9 million of the 22 million Adventists worldwide reside in sub-Saharan Africa, while approximately 35% of Adventists in North America are Black. Almost since the day Lucy Byard was refused treatment at the Adventist hospital, the major details of the event have been subject to the whim of the teller, and variant versions have become embedded in church lore. In 2017, in a good faith effort to come to grips with what happened to Lucy Byard, Advent Healthcare and the Columbia Union asked me to research the event. My findings were published by the Columbia Union Visitor in the March 2019 issue, Calvin Rock's Protest and Progress, published by the Andrews University Press, the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists article on Lucille Byard, Adventist Review Online, July 31, 2019, the Journal of Black Studies, numerous public forums, and other venues. In this video, I offer my findings, reconstructing the Byard event from primary sources, allowing the participants, especially those of color, to speak. Lucille Spence was born to Harriet and Jesse Spence on September 22, 1877, in Petersburg, Virginia. Lucy's parents were born into slavery in Southern Virginia in the 1850s, to be emancipated with the millions of other African Americans during and at the close of the Civil War. The Spences had many children, 8 in all, 5 daughters, including Lucy, and 3 sons. Harriet Spence had the considerable job of raising the children, while Jesse Spence made a living as a fireman for a railroad company. As was the case with many Blacks in the South during the Jim Crow era, not much is known about Lucy's childhood. She grew up in Petersburg and completed her second year of high school, but apparently did not receive any further formal education. Just less than half a year before the new century, on August 10, 1899, Lucy was married to Charles W. Lewis by a Reverend F.J. Walker in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Also born in Virginia, but 4 years after Lucy, Charles Lewis was a railway porter living in Allegheny. The newlyweds relocated to New York City shortly after their nuptials. It was in the bustling metropolis that Lucy discovered the Seventh-day Adventist Church, becoming a member at age 25 in 1902. In that year, out of a total of approximately 48,000 Adventists in the United States, the black membership is estimated to be around 500, with most residing in the South. As African Americans began the Great Migration to northern cities in the following decades, the black Adventist demographic would correspondingly shift. In Harlem, James Kemuel Humphrey, a Jamaican immigrant who converted to Adventism in New York City while on a layover to Africa a year before Lucy's conversion, was an early proponent of black autonomy in the Adventist Church, even proposing black-operated conferences, an arrangement which grassroots protest in response to Lucy's rejection would help bring about. Humphrey and his Harlem congregation left the Adventist Church in January 1930 behind Humphrey's contention that white Adventist leaders were apathetic and uninterested in the growth and prosperity of black Adventism. Upon her baptism, Lucy became one of the few black Adventists in the big city, a person with 3 strikes against her: race, gender, and religion. This third component of identity merits more attention in intersectionality studies, especially when the religion is one like Adventism, which featured tenets that manifested themselves prominently but were counter to the prevalent culture, such as observance of the Seventh-day Sabbath by going to church on Saturday. The question has often been posed as to why blacks who were already targets of discrimination would willingly accept another burden on their lives. A religion that was relatively new, was often considered strange, that didn't have many black adherents, that had a raft of prohibitions around adornment, diet, entertainment, and whose white leaders were not particularly progressive on areas of race. In fact, blacks embraced the Seventh-day Adventist faith for numerous reasons, which often overlapped, as evidenced by their conversion testimonials. One was a belief that the Adventists taught the truth according to the Bible, especially in the areas of their moniker, the observance of Saturday as a holy day, and the imminent parousia of Christ. There was also those who joined because of friendship evangelism, enterprising Adventists who befriended and assisted potential converts with food, shelter, or some other necessity, and at the opportune moment shared their faith. Others were simply born into a family of Adventists. Then there were blacks such as civil rights activist Louis C. Sheaf, a man who spent a considerable part of his life casting about for programs, organizations, and ideologies that would benefit blacks, who discerned in Adventism principles that could uplift his people. These principles included an emphasis on literacy and education, a Protestant work ethic, and a lifestyle of temperance and vegetarianism. The aforementioned J.K. Humphrey believed with his friend Sheaf that Adventism could elevate blacks, and before his departure from the church, he had in the works the creation of a health resort in the country that would teach blacks the church's lifestyle mores. Perhaps validating Sheaf and Humphrey's contention, by the time of Lucy's conversion to Adventism in 1902, there were a number of black Adventists who had, or soon would, distinguish themselves in various pursuits and become American firsts. Here are just a few. William J. Hardy, 1823 to 1888, was elected supervisor of Gaines Township in 1872, becoming the first black elected to office in the state of Michigan. Mary Britton, 1855 to 1925, was Kentucky's first woman licensed medical doctor and a civil rights activist of such a stature that Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote a poem that strove to immortalize her feats. James Childs, 1860 to 1930, argued the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad case for desegregation before the Supreme Court in 1910. Anna Knight, 1874 to 1972, was the first Black woman of any denomination to serve as a missionary in India, which she did from 1901 to 1906. Lottie Blake, 1876 to 1976, was for many years the sole Black female physician in the city of Birmingham, Alabama. Ruth Temple, 1892 to 1984, opened the first health clinic in the medically underserved community of Southeast Los Angeles, becoming the first African American woman to practice medicine in the city. Franklin Bryant, died 1909, was the first Black law graduate at the University of Colorado in 1907. And Rosetta Douglass Spragg, 1839 to 1906, daughter of Frederick Douglass, was a distinguished civil rights activist in her own right. Unfortunately, Lucy Byard's reason for accepting the Adventist faith is unknown. Whatever it was, though, she was one of the unsung lay people who laid the foundation for Gotham Adventism. In truth, religious evangelism in America's largest city was rough going, as fin de siècle missiologists considered New York City to be one of the most challenging areas of religious labor. Almost nothing is known of Byard's efforts because she was not an ordained man, and thus was not featured in the church's periodicals. However, there are two statements on Byard, the lay worker, from contemporary witnesses, although with some bias. Friend Greta Martin described Byard as, quote, an earnest, sincere believer and a faithful worker in the cause of the Lord, who was loved by all who knew her, unquote. Byard's granddaughter, Naomi R. Allen, remembered her as, quote, a strong, energetic church worker, one of 5 Black women who pioneered the work in New York City. All her life, she worked untiringly to build up the church. Apparently unable to have children, Byard supplemented her lay church work while teaching piano, while her husband Charles was a chauffeur for a wealthy family. In 1910, the couple lived on 98th Street. By 1920, they were renting a house on West 141st Street in Harlem. Tragically, Charles Lewis died shortly after turning 40 on January 26, 1922, leaving Lucy a widow. But 5.5 years later, Lucy found love again. James Henry Byard, a 58-year-old, twice widower with 5 children, was also from Virginia and made a living as a cellar worker in Queens. Both he and Lucy were avid musicians, Lucy playing the piano and organ and James the harmonica. The couple were married on September 23, 1928, at the First Harlem SDA Church by none other than James Humphrey. In a harsh irony, Humphrey presided over the wedding of a woman whose death would bring about the precise change in the church for which he departed from it for. James and Lucy's marriage was described by their granddaughter Allen, who spent half of her time with the Byards as, quote, a loving relationship. Lucy was a vital part of church life, playing the organ, teaching piano lessons, and directing the choir at the First Jamaica Seventh-day Adventist Church in Jamaica, Long Island. She was also renowned as a cook, and her ready, gracious hospitality, entertaining thousands of guests, including great builders of the Adventist Church, such as J.K. Humphrey, F.L. Peterson, Lewis B. Reynolds, and W.W. Fordham, throughout the decades in her homes in Queens and Long Island. She had a special gift for hospitality, Allen recalls. Her home and her heart were open to everyone. In the summer of 1943, Lucy, by then in her mid-60s, developed liver cancer with a chronic case of cachexia, or the wasting syndrome. According to her husband, James, she needed careful watch and attendance during that fateful summer. When it was clear that she required professional and medical attention, Lucy and James carefully considered to which hospital she should be taken. James states that he was, quote, suddenly deeply impressed to send her to Washington Adventist Sanitarium, of which place I was not referred to by anyone. James Byard asked Jeter E. Cox, the black pastor of the Bethel Seventh-day Adventist Church in nearby Brooklyn, to write a letter of introduction for him to the Washington Sanitarium, arranging for Lucy to be admitted there. Cox was ideal for this favor, not only because he was a respected minister, but because he had pastored in several states in the Columbia Union, the Adventist administrative area where the Washington Sanitarium was located, and had been the Negro representative for the Union. Established in 1907, the Washington Sanitarium was a 188-bed medical facility located just outside of the nation's capital in the leafy suburb of Tacoma Park, Maryland. Although by the early 1940s, the sanitarium was moving more toward the hospital model instead of the traditional lifestyle and retreat center pioneered by John Harvey Kellogg at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, it still adopted a more holistic approach to health and wellness with the central social component. Sanitarium patients would socialize together indoors and outdoors on the sanitarium grounds in the seasons when the weather was pleasant as part of their treatment. The General Conference, the administrative headquarters of the global Seventh-day Adventist Church, was located on the border of the Maryland-Washington, D.C. line, just minutes away from the Washington Sanitarium. The sanitarium was administered by a 10-member board of directors that included the GC treasurer, W.E. Nelson, as chair, and among its members, GC president J.L. McElhaney. The sanitarium's medical director was Robert A. Hare, a New Zealander from a prominent Adventist family who had earned a medical doctorate from the College of Medical Evangelists, now Loma Linda University, in 1925, and had been medical director at the Washington Sanitarium since 1938. The practice of the Washington Sanitarium in admitting and treating Black people is complicated. Prior to 1943, Blacks had been treated at the sanitarium, but on a limited, selective, and subpar basis. Only a certain kind of Black person would be admitted, only in emergency cases, and he could only be treated, quote, in an inconspicuous way, unquote, in the basement of the sanitarium by off-duty hospital staff. By 1943, the policy had changed. No Blacks were to be admitted to the Washington Sanitarium. This exclusion policy would shortly be articulated by Black Adventists as especially egregious, seeing that their considerable tithes and offerings helped fund the sanitarium's operations. It is important to note that when Jeter Cox agreed to inquire the sanitarium on behalf of Lucy Byard, that he did not know about the reversal policy at the sanitarium. When he had worked as Negro representative for the Columbia Union some years earlier, blacks could still be admitted to the sanitarium. Cox wrote a letter to the Washington Sanitarium, dated September 5, 1943, requesting a reservation be made on behalf of James and Lucy Byard, and inquiring about financial assistance for hospital fees. His letter was answered by one Miss Brooke from the sanitarium's credit office on September 9, with an enclosed form for part pay, part charity care. Cox responded to Brooke on September 14, advising her that the Bethel Church would cover Lucy Byard's medical expenses, paying $60 up front for the first week, and after that the hospital bills could be sent to the church. Brooke replied on September 17 that the arrangement was acceptable and that the sanitarium would be ready to admit Lucy Byard on Tuesday, September 21. Whether socioeconomic status would be a factor later is anyone's guess, but suffice it to say, the Byards were not as wealthy as a good deal of the clientele of the sanitarium. After Jeter Cox had made the requisite arrangements with Washington Sanitarium and received confirmation of the reservation, the Byards prepared to travel to Washington. Cox was set to drive them, but because of the gasoline shortage brought on by World War II, the couple opted for the train. James and Lucy Byard arrived at the train station in Washington, D.C. at 7:05 a.m. That's in the morning, Wednesday, September 22, 1943. James Byard describes what transpired next in a letter to G.E. Peters, Secretary or Director of the North American Colored Department, written 6 days later. Established in 1909, the Colored Department was located in the General Conference headquarters, a single full-time worker staffed office, tasked with managing the Adventist efforts for blacks in the United States. Its secretary, George Edwards Peters, 1883 to 1965, an Antiguan who had immigrated to the U.S. as a young adult, had successfully walked the tightrope of being trusted by the white leadership and black ministers and laypeople, and had risen to the highest position in the church available to a black minister at the time. James Byard wrote to Peters, "We, after much effort, arrived in Washington by rail and went directly to the sanitarium. I went to the office and informed them that I was Mr. James Byard of Jamaica, Long Island, and that Elder Cox had made reservations for my sick wife. The attendant acknowledged my reservation, went out and spoke to my wife, and proceeded upstairs. He returned shortly and called me into the office and told me that he regretted to say this, but it was against the law of the state of Maryland to admit colored people into the sanitarium. I, of course, was stunned, for my wife had been looking forward with much anticipation to going to this particular sanitarium because she felt that she would be among her own people. There would be an understanding among them that she could not expect in an outside hospital. In fact, her hopes were so high that her health was much better than it had been for days, and she even suffered the tiresome and painful train ride because of the expected destination. I warned the attendant of my wife's condition and reminded him that she needed immediate attention. Also, that I was not acquainted with any hospital in Washington, D.C., hoping that he might examine her and find out her critical state, but to no avail. I was utterly confused, and tried to get in touch with you, but was unsuccessful. The attendant recommended to me Freedman's Hospital and assured me that she would be accepted there. He called a taxi, told the driver of the hospital to take us to, and my wife and I were driven away. James Byard states in closing, "My wife is now in Freedman's Hospital under competent and watchful care. I have no remorses, but I thought I might bring to your attention the sudden and unpredictable manner in which she got there. I would greatly appreciate it if you would, at your convenience, find time to visit her." Medical Director Robert Hare had a different take on what happened, even though he never had any personal contact with the Byards. In a letter to the GC President and Secretary on November 15, a full 54 days after the episode, and about 2 weeks after the death of Lucy Byard, Hare was in crisis mode, trying to defuse an explosive situation that had gotten out of his control. He writes, "On September 21, a telegram was received at 11 p.m. stating that Miss Byard would arrive on the 7:05 train Wednesday morning. Elder Cox asking that she be met. As we do not have special means of meeting patients, they took a taxi cab and arrived at the sanitarium between 9 and 10. Mr. Baker called me immediately and told me of the fact that Mrs. Byard was a colored person. In view of the fact that we had carried on our correspondence, not knowing that she was colored, I advised that we receive her into the institution, giving her a private room, and arrange for her meals to be sent on trays, and plan for her examination and diagnosis by our physicians in off hours, hoping that Mrs. Byard would see the fairness of this in view of our misunderstanding and the social sentiment that exists in Maryland. As an alternative, Mr. Baker and I suggested the idea that she might go to Freedman's Hospital in Washington and have the diagnostic work done which she desired. I did not come to the office to meet Mrs. Byard at the time, feeling that in all probability she would elect to take the private room. When I finished my rounds, I came back to my office and inquired what she had decided to do. I learned then that she and her husband had refused to accept our offer of a private room and had gone to Freedman's Hospital. Hare's recounting may seem innocuous enough, but in a letter to W.E. Nelson, GC Treasurer and Chair of the Washington Sanitarium Board, half a year later, Hare reveals his true sentiments. He wrote, quote, "I cannot feel that the sanitarium should be called upon to carry a mixed clientele. We have persons of high degree and low degree of the white race, and no question exists with regard to their presence here. But were colored patients seen in our buildings, there will immediately rise numerous complicating questions, and certain groups of our patients, such as those coming from Virginia and the Carolinas, would be expected to take a degree of offense at their presence. I would just as willingly minister to the needs of a colored patient as anyone else, but mentally, emotionally, and in certain physiological respects, they differ from the white, and I do not favor mixing them." Hare continues, sharing his thoughts on the possibility of admitting African Americans to the sanitarium. "Should we take a portion of the first floor of the hospital that would bring in visiting Negro groups in cars close to our nurses' dormitory, I do not see any just grounds on which we could say we would maintain a Negro ward and limit admissions on a religious basis. This would be quite contrary to hospital practice, so we would possibly open a contact with the Negro population entering our grounds more or less regularly. And right now, I feel that the Sligo Creek and the woods along it are little enough barrier between us and the local Negro settlements. W.E. Nelson's reply to Hare's letter reveals sentiments equally prejudiced. He writes, "You mentioned that patients from the Carolinas and Virginia would object, but I believe patients coming from the District of Columbia and Maryland and from every other state would object almost as strenuously. The psychology of these black people is so different from the white that it would be impossible for us to mix them. Some have suggested that we have a wing in the hospital. That would be all right if we did not have a sanitarium in connection with it. It has been amusing to me to observe the colored brethren who have attended the Bookmen's Convention. There have been 20 or 30 present, and in years past, they used to find seats together. But now they studiously scatter themselves in every part of the room, many times only one colored person in a place. As I view the whole situation, Dr. Hare, it is not a matter of the colored people wanting a little sanitarium of their own where they can receive attention. But what they want is racial and social equality." These baldly racist statements by the medical director and board chair of the Washington Sanitarium evince that the Byards grasped the true sentiments of the sanitarium staff when they did not feel welcome. These upstanding and sincere Adventists, who happened to be black, were not welcomed in an Adventist institution whose charter it was to heal the sick. As both James Byard and Robert Hare attest, after Lucy was rejected at Washington Sanitarium, the Byards took a taxi across town, approximately 6 miles, to Freedman's Hospital, today's Howard University Hospital. Founded in 1862 during the Civil War, 5 years before its current namesake, Howard University, Freedman's Hospital was the first medical facility of its size and stature in the nation, established specifically for the treatment of black people. At the time that Lucy Byard was admitted to Freedman's, Charles Drew, the renowned medical researcher, was chief surgeon there. A young J. Mark Cox, a black Adventist who was a physician in training, was interning at Freedman's at the time and gave special attention to Lucy, as James Byard wrote, providing competent and watchful care. Cox lamented that at Freedman's, quote, "the news spread like wildfire that an Adventist institution would not accept one of its own members." No sooner had Lucy and James Byard been turned away from the Washington Sanitarium than word of it spread among the approximately 16,000 black Adventists around the United States. Emotions ranging from disbelief to frustration to sadness to rage, all the more poignant because of the betrayal of the Christian principles of love and oneness that purportedly united Adventists of all colors. Most glaringly, blacks were supporting Adventist institutions, including the Washington Sanitarium, with their tithes and offerings, monies that were funneled disproportionately to white institutions where blacks were not admitted. For black Adventists of the time, the rejection of the innocent Lucy Byard was a representation of all that was hypocritical and hideous about the church's racism beneath the chimera of Christianity. The half year between mid-October 1943 to mid-April 1944 witnessed Black Adventists mobilize as never before, a coming of age of this contingent of the American religion. Byard's rejection, a shorthand for blacks' universal rejection by white Adventists, was a rallying point for the major sectors of Black Adventism. They sprang into action and wielded heretofore untested power and influence for racial justice in their church. It should be stressed that the Black protest machine began to mobilize and demand change before Byard died. Indeed, the Byard incident mobilized into action every sector of Black Adventism, but especially the laity. Non-clergy beyond the reach of white church administrators' punitive reach and censor. 2 weeks after the Byard incident, roughly a dozen laypeople formed the Committee for the Advancement of Worldwide Work among colored Seventh-day Adventists, the most effectual grassroots movement in the history of the church. On a Saturday night in the back room of a Washington, D.C. bookstore near Howard University and near Freedmen's Hospital. The committee was comprised of influential individuals and educated laypeople like Eva B. Dykes, the first Black woman to complete the requirements for a PhD, and a professor at Howard University at the time, and the aptly named Valerie Omega Justice. In 1950, the second Black Adventist to earn a PhD, who vigorously and forcefully compelled both white and Black Adventist clergy administrators to make real and lasting changes to rectify the church's egregious discriminatory practices. The committee's 8-page April 1944 manifesto, "Shall the Four Freedoms Function Among Seventh-day Adventists?" systematically outlines the Jim Crow conditions in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Blacks generally not being admitted to Adventist schools and hospitals. Blacks not being employed at Adventist institutions. Blacks lacking representation among church leadership. Tithes and offerings given by blacks being diverted to white Adventist concerns. Church policies ignoring Black members and institutions. And racial segregation marking worship services in Adventist churches. Freedoms was in the possession of each delegate who voted to approve Black-run conferences on April 10, 1944, placed in their hands by committee members at the meeting in an unofficial capacity. Other lay groups in Adventism joined fellow Blacks in the U.S. and around the world and played their part in the Byard protest movements. Several Black Adventist congregations contacted the GC president at the church's headquarters, denouncing the treatment of Byard. Byard's home church, First Jamaica SDA, in fact, wrote McElhaney a letter signed by 16 members, including James Byard, 5 days before Byard's death, threatening to sue the church for damages if it did not promptly pay Byard's traveling expenses to Washington. McElhaney and Washington Sanitarium promptly complied. Black Adventist congregations, in fact, turned into hotbeds of righteous foment, chief among them being Ephesus and First Church in Washington, D.C., Ephesus in Harlem, Ebenezer in Philadelphia, Ethnan Temple in Pittsburgh, Shiloh in Chicago, and Riverside in Nashville. Additionally, there were groups such as the Ohio Lay Membership Units and the Association for the Advancement of Advent Youth that did their part in their respective spheres to achieve Black equality. Equally vital were the efforts of laypersons acting independently. One example was Stark O. Cherry, an African-American physician from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he served as an elder at Ethne Temple. On March 8, 1944, Cherry drove from Pittsburgh to Washington to meet with GC President McIlhenny at his office, and in a precise manner laid before him the racial sins of the church and the steps needed for atonement. Deeply impressed, McIlhenny requested that Cherry send him a follow-up letter with the points they discussed. The next day, Cherry sent the requested letter, 3.5 pages, to McIlhenny, who in turn forwarded it to each union president shortly after, a move that could only have encouraged a yes vote for black conferences a month later. Upon Cherry's recommendation in the letter that a black lay delegate be sent from each union, 7 of the 11 unions in North America sent a black delegate to the spring meeting in Chicago the next month, with Cherry appointed as the delegate for the Columbia Union. Meanwhile, at Freedman's Hospital, Lucy's condition began to worsen. Although the effect the traumatic event at Washington Sanitarium had on Lucy's health is not known, it could not have been positive. If what James Byard said when Cox gave word that Lucy would be admitted into the sanitarium was true, that Lucy's, quote, hopes were so high that her health was much better than it had been for days, then her spirits undoubtedly sagged and her health worsened after she was turned away by her own people. 38 days after being denied equal treatment at the sanitarium, Lucille Byard died at Freedman's Hospital on October 30, 1943. The immediate cause of death was cachexia, or wasting away, and her death due to carcinoma of the liver, or liver cancer. Her body was transported to Brooklyn, New York, while her funeral was held in Harlem at the Ephesus Seventh-day Adventist Church. Hundreds of distraught and upset mourners attended the service, with 13 ministers officiating, led by J.K. Humphrey. Lucy Byard is buried at the Siloam section of Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York.